Hello, everyone. Welcome to the beginning of our discussion on the emergence of complex societies in East Asia. One thing that is important to note, as with many parts of the world, but which will play a key role in our future discussion of the spread of different kinds of agriculture in East Asia, the colder, drier climate during the Pleistocene in this area meant that steppe habitats, what we tend to associate with places today like Mongolia, were dominant even into the northern half of what is today China. Looking at this area here, specifically the Huanghe River Valley in northern China, where a great deal of early development of agriculture and settled village life and eventually complex society begins. The Huanghe River takes its name from the vast quantities of loess soil, which is wind-blown sediment, a great deal of which was produced during the terminal Pleistocene with lowered sea levels and larger expanses of seafloor exposed to wind erosion. This was picked up and transported across the world and deposited in large quantities in a number of places, including northern China, areas of Europe, North America, and these areas became some of the regions where you saw the initial development of agricultural traditions, partly because this loess soil is both fertile and relatively easy to cultivate. You don't have to break through huge amounts of turf like you do in the plains of North America. You don't have to cut down huge giant trees like you had to in some parts of Europe and elsewhere, because the loess soil, being windblown and fine-grained, is so unconsolidated that large trees are unable to become well established, especially in more northerly climates where you see snow. That snow falls on the trees, it accumulates on the branches, and if the tree is growing in very unconsolidated, fine-grained, wind-blown sediment, it gets to a certain size, eventually it's just going to fall over from the weight of wind and snow and water that falls upon it. So loess soil deposits are very interestingly linked to many of these regions with early agricultural traditions. Some of the earliest sites in the region are the Shizitan sites, and these localities date all the way back into the Pleistocene, 21,000 BCE. But the parts that are interesting for our story of the emergence of complex societies here are the ones where we begin to see the harvesting of wild millet. But it's not a continuous cycle. The environmental shifts back and forth during the Ice Age between full glacial and interglacial periods mean that you don't have a consistent directional shift. And so during some time periods of the occupation of these sites, you see wild millet being harvested, as well as acorns and wild yams when you move into warmer time periods. This, though, is the earliest evidence here in northern China for the human use of foxtail millet. The transition to farming here in northern China can first be seen at a series of sites, including Lijiagu, where you see very, very trace amounts of pottery, just tiny amounts of it, hunted game, and the people living there appear to have begun the process of millet domestication. And this occurred during the period between approximately 9,000 to 7,500 BCE. And other sites, such as Nanzhuangtou and Donggulin, contain important evidence of this momentous period in East Asian history as well. Throughout the transition, one of the fascinating things is that you see the use of sophisticated grinding tools becoming more and more specialized, becoming more and more finely made, moving away from just a simple stone slab to these large carved and pecked footed metates, as we would call them in the New World, and also amounts of pottery increased. So you see the in situ development of these traditions. It's not like as we'll see later in some other regions, the whole tradition comes in as an entire package. They're beginning to make pottery very early, but the amounts of it increase through this time frame. Another really important site, you can see the map there in the upper left, Jiahu in the upper Y River Valley. This river valley is often considered the dividing line between northern and southern China. And dating between about 7,000 and 5,500 BCE, this site is considered the first fully settled agricultural village thus far excavated in China. In addition to bird bone flutes illustrated in your textbook, the identification of ceramic kilns in addition to the pottery itself was of particular note. Stone tools were still the medium by which people here produced knives, axes, projectile points, and grinding implements. This is still very much a Neolithic settlement. What's interesting is that in the archaeological investigation at this site, 396 human burials were excavated, and there was little indication of major social ranking or structural inequality. One particularly fascinating find here were incised turtle bones. And given the early date of this is fascinating, especially with the later development of divinatory turtle bones representing some of the earliest examples of writing in East Asia in later Shang and other sites in China. The symbols on the Jiahu turtle bones are more symbols than true writing, but one might say that the seeds of that later development were already planted. I suppose that's a bad Neolithic joke. But anyway, what else is really interesting is that the oldest known alcoholic beverage has been recovered from ceramics in burials at Jiahu. And for more details on how these ancient beverages have been researched and replicated, you can see this Smithsonian Magazine article that I've also posted to the Canvas site that talks about the process of archaeological investigation of residues on ceramic vessels and then their recreation, figuring out what different kinds of ingredients and components went into them. On the left here, you can see a bottle of this carefully, experimentally replicated version of the beverage that they identified in the ceramics at Jiahu, this Neolithic site, and this is produced by Dogfish Head Brewing Company. A number of major early farming cultures in China between 7,000 and 4,500 BC thrive in this northern and central part of China. You can see already there mentioned Jiahu, the oldest one in the region with agriculture. You see other traditions in that same river valley, including Laoguntai, Peilegang, Huli, Shisan, together with the other sites in the Yangtze Valley that we're going to talk about here in a minute. But these two different traditions are based upon different foundations. In the north, the cereal staple crop is the millet, and you see a fair amount of structural systems in place in these communities where the amount of inequality in the sites of the northern Huanghe River Valley are much less pronounced than those that we'll see here in a minute when we look at the Yangtze. Moving forward in time to about 5,000 to 3,500 BCE, you see the Yangshao culture. In the Yangshao culture, it's interesting, you begin to see the construction of defensive structures around large permanent settlements with these round semi-subterranean houses. It is interesting that there seems to be community-organized production in some of these areas, with certain structures set aside for the production of particular kinds of crafts. We see domesticated pigs, cattle, and dogs, in addition to that central cereal staple of millet. Towards the end of this period, however, there appears to have been rapid development and expansion of social inequality. And found alongside that development of social inequality, you see finely crafted objects of ivory and jade among the status markers that were used by an increasingly entrenched elite social class. So this is a really fascinating time period where you see it's not the emergence of agriculture, it's not the emergence of villages, but what's happening during the Yangshao period is the emergence of inequality. Then in the lower Wanghe Valley, closer to the coastline, we see the Dawenko culture. You can see the use of jade and remarkable burials with some very beautiful and fine ceramic technology here. Also, increasing division of labor and structural inequality during this time period. What's fascinating is that the introduction of rice to the northern river valley is occurring from the south, from the Yangtze Valley. Rice is introduced to the Wanghe, and as rice becomes more important than millet, the first people that we see, based upon evidence from their teeth and isotopic studies of their bones, this is more important for higher ranking people. So rice was a status food initially here in the northern portions of China. Craft specialization and technical innovations are occurring during this time period, including the potter's wheel first being used. And within society, and based upon analyses of both residential architecture and cemetery assemblages, we see that these communities of the Dawenko are comprised of a large majority of poorer families and a very small minority of rich men and their wives occupying and ruling over these settlements of this time period. Moving south, we have to talk about the Yangtze River Valley. The Yangtze is one of the most powerful river systems in the world. It's the longest river in Asia and the third longest in the world, and drains 1/5 of China's land area. Its banks are home to 1/3 of China's population, which comes out to over 10% of the entire population of the planet lives somewhere along this river. And for the Yangtze Valley, climate plays a role. Again, between about 16,000 and 8,000 BCE, you see this warming climate that we do everywhere at the end of the last ice age. But rather than making life more difficult for plants and animals of southern China, it actually improved conditions for many, especially wild rice. The range of this species expanded northward and it flourished. People took advantage of this newly expansive resource during this time period. The site of Yuchanyang in Hunan province was occupied between about 16,000 and 12,000 BCE, and it includes wild animal remains and evidence for wild rice harvesting with knives made from shell. This is the first evidence for pottery sherds being found here in southern China, and represents one of the earliest examples anywhere in the world, slightly younger than the Jomon ceramics from Japan. I will point out, though, that there is a limit to how much warming can be tolerated, even by tropical species such as rice. And the fact that this represented a climatic amelioration and that people were able to take advantage of it as rapidly as they were is partly due to the fact that there were only about 3 million people on the entire planet 15,000 years ago. Today, well over 7 billion. And so the ability of our systems to take advantage of these kinds of shifts is significantly reduced. All you have to do is look at what's happening here in spring of 2020 to get an idea. So, the origins of rice cultivation. During the long warming period between 8,000 and 6,000 BCE, which you know elsewhere, as we talked about, contributed to the collapse of the Near Eastern Neolithic, rice expanded northward into the Yangtze Valley, and domesticated rice, along with pottery tempered with actual rice chaff, the sort of husk shell of the rice grain itself, is being used to temper the pottery, to give you an idea of the quantities that people are producing of this byproduct. Stone tool industries, though, interestingly, demonstrate some degree of local cultural continuity, arguing against population replacement and for the local adoption of new subsistence practices from the south. A very important site of Tianlushan, located near the coast, close to Hangzhou, near south of Shanghai, dating to between about 5,000 and 3,000 BCE. These were large wooden houses in this village, built atop wooden pilings, big wooden pilings in a swampy environment. You can see in this photograph here an example of these remarkably preserved sites. They're waterlogged, much in a differential preservation environment, and these are 6,000-year-old wooden pilings that have been preserved. Remarkable. In addition to that, we see wooden oars, net sinkers made out of stone, fishing spears, associated with the remains of sharks and even whales, crocodiles, turtles. And this all really attests to the importance of watercraft and aquatic resources along with this new rice cultivation economy. The large number and variety of animal bones, though, indicate intensive hunting of a varied environment. They had access both to drier uplands as well as wetter coastlines, riverine resources, as well as areas away from that environment. So they were harvesting resources from a relatively large catchment area, relatively large zone around their site. There are many ceramic vessels now at the site of Tianlushan in a wide array of styles, and some of them even have rice starch grains still adhering to the interior of these vessels. There was also highly developed weaving technology present, so textiles were a key component of the economy here. And what's fascinating is that the site of Tianlushan is part of a pattern that we see throughout the lower Yangtze Valley that's indicative of rapid expansion into new areas, including to islands in the South China Sea. As we see continued expansion of Neolithic farmers between 4,500 and 2,500 BCE, you see sites of the Daxi culture where you begin to see walled towns and highly stratified status within societies. A prime example is the site of Chengtushan that you can see a map of here that has a complete moat, and it's built on this island, this artificial island in the middle of a lake, and it includes an incredible density of ceramics and architectural planning. And this is really a dramatic change from some of the more early developments where you see cultivation being grafted onto earlier hunting and gathering traditions and being incorporated into these. This is a whole process from start to finish, the creation of this town and this settlement centered around the cultivation of rice. What's fascinating is that the genetic studies that they've done on the burials from the site of Chengtushan are not found with any frequency at all among populations of the area today. Instead, their closest living relatives today are the Hmong populations to this much further south in Southeast Asia, in Laos and other places like that, suggesting that the Chengtushan occupants may have been among the ancestors of those populations that survive today. Another one of these cultures found in the area shown on the map there is the Qijialing culture between 3,300 and 2,500 BCE. What's really interesting discovery I want to point out from the Qijialing period is that as these populations grew beyond the 10,000s in some of the larger, quote, capital sites, we begin to see evidence for a higher disease load, poor sanitation, and decreased health for the majority of the population. By the period of 2,500 to 1,700 BCE, large walled cities begin to form, and the transition to state-level political organization ushers in a new phase of history in the region. As farming expanded from the Yangtze towards the south, you begin to see some really interesting processes. One particular site, the site of Mon Bac in Vietnam, dates to about 1900 BCE. And at this site, you see burial practices very distinct from earlier hunting and gathering populations of the region, suggesting a population migration from the north into the area. Of particular note is the fact that the bioarchaeological analyses of the skeletal population from Manbach Cemetery indicates that the local hunting and gathering populations and the in-migrating farmers from southern China integrated and formed new communities that combine the strengths and traditions of each. There's a lot of parallels in the material culture to the southern Chinese Neolithic. Fishing was very important to the subsistence practices, much as it had been earlier from the hunting and gathering period. But there was a dramatic increase in axes and woodworking tools when you compare it to that earlier time period. Also, spindle whorls, shown there in the picture, the clay, sort of donut looking things, are part of the technological assemblage that comes in and are associated with spinning and weaving of cordage and textiles. But it's very complex. The processes of change are not universal. Nowhere in this region, in fact. A classic example of this is the site of Kok Phanom Di in Thailand, shown on the map there, occupied between about 2000 and 1500 BCE. This was a sedentary maritime hunting and gathering society which, despite having early contact with rice farming communities upstream, and even later in migration of rice farming populations, the people of Kok Phanom Di maintained an economy strongly centered on fishing due to the difficulty of rice farming in this salty, brackish estuarine setting. And so, even where these populations become incorporated into larger systems of trade and exchange and cultural transmission, some of these earlier pre-existing subsistence practices maintain themselves even as agriculture becomes established in the vicinity. And so Kok Phanom Di goes to show us that as this larger process of agricultural change and development and expansion of populations occurred, it wasn't just a wave that swept over everything and completely obliterated everything that had been before. In some places, like we talked about earlier, with where you see a syncretism, a joining between in-migrating farmers and previous populations forming something new. Other times, the earlier populations manage to maintain a certain amount of autonomy within that larger setting. And the people of Kok Phanom Di are well known for having some of these incredibly rich burials where they're acquiring an incredible amount of goods and wealth from trade and exchange along these river systems of Southeast Asia. Moving to the northern side of this process, we see the expansion of farming into Korea. The early Chulmun culture from about 5500 to 3500 BCE can be characterized as primarily coastal or riverine hunter-gatherers, not too dissimilar from ethnohistoric groups of the northwest coast of North America. They're at similar latitudes. It's a similar kind of climate in some ways. These were not mobile hunter-gatherers, and they lived in settled communities in a rich environment with which they had long experience and deep knowledge. These traditions are not coming into an empty landscape by any stretch of the imagination. Just like in Southeast Asia, the movement of agriculture in there was not moving into an empty environment, but encountering populations that had been there for millennia. During the Middle Chulmun, between about 3500 to 2000 BCE, millet agriculture is introduced from northeast China, has a rapid effect on both the size and distribution of settlements, with farming moving in an east-west direction across the Korean peninsula within a short span of only a few centuries. However, acorns and wild harvested plants and animals still comprised about half of the subsistence through this period. So again, this is one of those examples where there appears to be the introduction of farming of these crops, but there does not appear to necessarily be an in-migration of population from northeast China. They continue using a lot of the local varieties of architecture and ceramics and storage facilities. Community layout seems to be consistent. Rice, why does rice so much later in Northeast Asia than in other parts of this pattern? Well, rice, Oryza, the species, various species of Oryza, the genus, is originally a tropical plant. And so it required a longer period of domestication and selective breeding to fare well on the Korean peninsula, which is substantially colder than all but the northernmost provinces of China. Oryza sativa, the subspecies japonica, which is the one that eventually takes hold in Korea, is more resistant to cold. The plants are shorter and they have rounder, harder grains than the indica varieties. The establishment of rice farming by around 1000 BCE on the Korean Peninsula had a similar effect here, but with a dramatic increase in social inequality and population densities. These dolmen tombs, shown there on the top center of this slide, are diagnostic of this time period and resemble late Neolithic tombs in Western Europe. And you can see top right there a map of the Korean Peninsula showing all the locations of these late Neolithic tombs. And from Korea, we move to Japan. For at least 30,000 years, Japan was occupied by sophisticated hunting, fishing, and gathering populations. Around 1500 BCE, these people are known to archaeologists as the Jomon, but their culture extends back over 16,000 years. And they are the direct ancestors of today's Ainu people from the northern portion of the Japanese archipelago. The gentleman shown there is Ainu. The Ainu, or the Jomon, produced incredibly sophisticated ceramics and groundstone tools and large towns and villages that were occupied by hundreds of people for centuries. The landscape was somewhat different, with glaciers occupying the higher mountains of Honshu and certainly in Hokkaido. But their ability and focus on marine resources and forest environments is something that has persisted until recent times among the descendants of the Jomon, these Ainu people. Despite the fact that they're usually seen as very complex, sedentary hunter-gatherers, the Jomon people, much like the people throughout the world that we begin to understand hunting and gathering populations more, the hunters and gatherers of California, for example, the native First Nations of California, they were engaged in extensive landscape management. In Japan, this involved the tending of wild populations. I put in wild in quotation marks because it's somewhere between that border of domesticated and wild, right? They're tending them. They're encouraging the right kind of vegetation. They're burning off fields. They're diverting streams to flood them. So it's not entirely left to its own devices. Some of the plants that the Ainu were clearly tending wild stands of include adzuki beans, bottle gourds, and even shiso plants were clearly being managed by Ainu or Jomon populations. Around 800 BCE, Yayoi farmers, likely from the Korean Peninsula, arrived in Japan with a fully formed rice-based farming system. First on the island of Kyushu, but within a very, very short period of time, only a few centuries, had spread throughout Shikoku and Honshu Islands, with only the more extreme climates of Hokkaido in the north and the Ryukyu Islands in the south remaining occupied by hunting and gathering peoples. By the early centuries of the Common Era, the social friction, both with local Jomon populations as well as between Yayoi settlements, prompted people to begin constructing wooden walled towns on hills and other defensible landforms. During this time period, both silk weaving and the beginnings of a metalworking tradition that would become second to none in the world eventually begin in Japan during the Yayoi period. And these Yayoi traditions would give rise to later Japanese cultural traditions, the later Kofun tradition, eventually becoming one of the principal roots of modern Japanese ethnic identity. And as the Yayoi moved into the central islands of Honshu, Kyushu, and Shikoku, the Jomon populations were displaced towards the north and towards the south. Today, being found only, the descendants being found only on the islands of Hokkaido and the Kuril and Sakhalin island systems to the north. You can see in the bottom left here of this slide examples of other remarkably well-preserved wooden tools associated with rice agriculture. And these are things that just appear wholesale at the beginning of the Yayoi period. So in contrast to some of these other examples in the Korean Peninsula in Southeast Asia, where we see a transition, where we see combinations of traditions, the Yayoi example does appear to be a genuine displacement of earlier populations by these in-migrating farmers rather than a local adoption by populations that had been there for centuries. Here you can see some, on the bottom left is actually a model from a museum display, and the top two are artists' representations of what a Yayoi period settlement might have looked like at the time. And this is a view of Himeji Castle in Kyoto, Japan, built around AD 1609, one of the most iconic Japanese architectural examples of Japanese architecture known. The bottom line with a lot of this is that the development of millet and rice agriculture in East Asia had a dramatic effect, not just on population densities, but on where people lived, on how populations related to the natural world, how they related to each other. And the stories, and I say that intentionally, stories plural, that can be told about how that played out in different places, how it played out in Vietnam and Thailand and Cambodia, how it played out in Korea, how it played out in Japan, the influences back and forth that we haven't even gotten into between the Hwanghae Yellow River and the Yangtze River traditions, and how they mutually influenced each other and eventually results in the formation of one of the most powerful state-level societies in the ancient world, is a remarkably complex and fascinating story. And this is just the very beginning of that story. I hope you guys have enjoyed this. I hope you've learned something. And I look forward to seeing you very soon. Remember, if you have any questions, please post them to the discussion board and I'll answer them there. You can also remember to come to office hours any of the 3 days that we have it scheduled. Have a wonderful day. I'll talk to you soon.